Today's episode of the Steve Beaman Show for Monday, September 29th, 2025. We have a lot to cover today. We're going to talk about current events, including the shooting in Michigan and other things, and we're going to talk about our main issue of economics. Is there another model of economics in addition to socialism or capitalism? I think there is. So let's unpack that on today's episode of the Steve Beaman Show.
In a world of uncertainty, where business, freedom, and the future hang in the balance, one voice rises with clarity, experience, wisdom, and conviction. This is the Steve Beaman Show, the voice of the independent American.
Welcome, my friends, to this episode. I'm glad to be with you all, and I hope you're having a great day out there. We are broadcasting this now through a number of platforms. We hope to get much more involvement with you. I love the communication between me and the folks that I get to meet. So I look forward to hearing from you and getting to know you even better. I'm now live on YouTube with this, so if you're on YouTube and you want to share thoughts, please do. In the top news today, we're going to talk about first this Michigan shooting. As you know, there was a shooting at an LDS church in Michigan. We don't know that much about it, or I don't, but I know that it was a Marine who had a child with a genetic problem. There were apparently some financial issues with that, and so that's all we know. I don't really know why he did it. We don't know the motivation at the core, but it is part of an overall meltdown we're seeing in our society as it relates to violence. You see it, and I see it, and we feel it. Well, this is something I have been talking about literally since about 1990, when I began to see the U.S. moving away from its Judeo-Christian roots into a world that I used to call the Mad Max world. And let me give you a specific on that. If you go back into the 70s when I grew up, you never said to somebody, "Do you go to church?" You said to them when you met them, "Oh, where do you go to church?" It was presumed that people went to church, either a synagogue or a Catholic church or a Protestant church. It didn't matter. They went somewhere. And over the years, we've lost that. We've lost this societal adherence to the values created by a Judeo-Christian culture. Well, that puts us at odds with our Constitution, when I think it was John Adams who said this was built for a moral and religious people. The reason for that is our Constitution presumes life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness for the individual. But when you take a governor's rails out of it, government, and I'll say an ethos of Judeo-Christian values, you take that governor off, you now have chaos. Because you have individual freedom with no measure, no way to boundary it. And that's what we're seeing more and more, is this chaos. And that's going to continue, unfortunately, until we as a society decide to go back to a shared idea, and specifically of the Judeo-Christian values, or we decide that chaos isn't what we want. And I fear that goes to a Brave New World, or 1994. I see bad things happening on the other side of that. Well, kind of continuing on that, Charlie Kirk's shooter today did go into a hearing. It was to see if there's a need for a preliminary hearing and all that. It's a court process. I think there's enough evidence to take the guy to trial. I think most people do. And so we'll see what happens. But they're going to seek the death penalty for sure. And that's just tragic from the whole get-go. What a class act Erica was when she said she could find it in her heart to forgive. That's really, really a special time in our country's history that she said that. But on this guy, I am of the mind that this shooter did it, that he was a lone gunman. I know some people, especially if you're in the Candace Owens camp, you might say there's a conspiracy here of a larger scale. I hear the arguments. I don't see the facts. So until I see facts, I'll stay on this idea that there was a lone gunman. And I'll hope that is the true way that it happened out. But until we see facts, we want to be very careful of the conspiracies, because they connect dots that might not really be connected. We don't know. So we'll continue to watch that. The third thing I want to chat with you about in this contemporary news section, if you will, is the government shutdown that is going to be inevitable come October 1st. What this is caused by is that every year the government's on a fiscal year, and September 30th is the end of its fiscal year. Well, barring some legislation, there's absolutely no money to carry it forward October 1st and beyond. So what happens is typically they come into what's known as continuing resolution. And it's just a short-term band-aid that says we're going to continue everything as it is for a few weeks until we can get a budget put in place. Okay. Now, government has oftentimes done just sequential continuing resolutions in lieu of doing a budget, and I'm going to guess they're probably going to do the same thing this time. But what they're doing is saying, let's just keep everything the way it is. Let's give it 13 weeks. I think that's how long it's for. And let's see if we can't come up with a budget in the next 13 weeks. Well, the Democrats are saying, nope, we're not going to sign it unless you put back the monies that the big, beautiful bill took out of Medicaid and took out of Obamacare subsidies. The Republicans are saying, look, this isn't the time to argue that. We'll argue that in the budget process. Let's just keep things going so we don't, hurt the people by shutting the government down. Now, the question is, does it really hurt you to shut the government down or not? I don't think so, actually. I'm kind of a believer that at the end of the day, it's not going to affect most people. But if they do shut it down, Trump has threatened to lay off tens of thousands of federal workers. That will have an economic impact, especially in and around Washington. Could you argue that some of that's just fluff and not necessary? Probably. So it could just be a cut to the budget. I think time will tell. By the way, on the budget, I want to give you some really, really surprisingly good news. I've spoken a lot on the fact that we have these $37 trillion debts, these $1 trillion trade deficits, and I've talked a lot about our deficits. And I talk about them because I don't see them going down. Well, I've been wrong. Our deficit now is below 1.9 trillion. That's remarkable. It's on its way down. That's partly because of the tariff revenues. It's partly because of changing government spending and some of the reductions through the big, beautiful bill thing. But we're actually seeing our deficit come down. That's remarkable. That may be the nicest thing I've seen in a long time. That together with really what was good growth in the second quarter at 3.8%, that's quite a bit of a nice boom to our economy. So we'll keep an eye on the shutdown. If it really happens, it happens. So be it. But I want to talk today about the idea of capital or economics. And I'm doing this because I've spent my life in economics. I've been an economic consultant, a financial consultant. I've done all kinds of stuff in the world of money. And I see posts day after day after day after day that really are split in two camps. You have the pro-government camp, and Robert Reich is a big spokesman there, and these are the Keynesians for the most part. They believe in income equality. They believe that government can be the ultimate arbiter in the economy, that it can put money in when the economy's slow and take money out when the economy's too fast. That's their mindset. The other side come out of the Adam Smith or the Milton Friedman camp. They believe that the free market will solve the problems better and for a more permanent situation than having government get involved, which just puts Band-Aids on things. I tend to agree with that because, to my mind, government never solves a problem. It just pushes that problem either down the road or onto another person. So I tend to come down on that. But my point isn't which side you come down on. It's that when you finally get to the end of the day, it's no wonder they call it the dismal science. Both of these sides put out economic models that support their philosophical positions. So economics becomes philosophy. What do you believe in, individual rights or community rights? Whichever you believe in, your economics is going to follow that. Do you believe in a Judeo-Christian ethic and economic model, or do you believe in a secular Marxist economic model? Again, those are where you get your economics. So what I want to talk about today is what I call biblical economics. And I want to do that because I've talked about this transition into the digital age that we're now coming down to, and I think it's real. I think tomorrow doesn't look like yesterday in the world of economics, even to the point of the rule of supply and demand could be in question for the first time in my life. We've lived in an economy of resource allocation for the last 1,000 years. Going forward into the digital economy, well, it may not be about resource allocation. We may be in a situation where there's plenty of supply. It's just demand management. And that's a weird world. But we could be getting there. So as I look at that, I think that one of the things I hope you and I will both look at is this idea of biblical economics. The Bible teaches us to build our houses on rock, not on sand, because under a storm, the one on rock is going to sustain, the one on sand will wash away. So I want to talk about 4 parts of what you could think of as biblical economics. And they're all important and they're all relevant, and they're relevant in a sense to what kind of philosophy you have on how you run your economic life. The first point that I want to make is that at the core of biblical economics is this notion of stewardship. God is the owner of everything. It says in Psalms 24, verse 1, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. What Scripture teaches is that everything belongs to God. Your house, your car, your money, your company, your children, your spouse, yourself. We are but stewards over that which God has given us. That notion of stewardship then becomes foundational to how we should look at our economic beliefs. We're stewards over the resources we have. We're not building them for our purposes, we're building them for God's purposes. And if we keep that in mind, it eliminates the risk of greed, corruption, and chaos. So stewardship becomes a driving mindset that all of us and I'm going to say just generically, the Judeo-Christian world have to adhere to. It's both Old and New Testament. You're a steward over what God has given you. And that stewardship, it gives us a biblical view of accountability. And without accountability, you have chaos. So if we look at our lives as stewards and accountable to God for how we are stewarding things, that gives us a boundary around our behavior. And that stewardship then becomes the cornerstone of how we should look at biblical economics. You're a steward, not an owner. Secondly, I want to go into this idea of work. And I want to talk about this because I see more and more videos about younger people, especially, not wanting to go to work. They don't think it's worthy of them, or they don't think they're capable of it, or they don't think they have anxiety, whatever the reason, they don't want to work. Well, the reason they don't want to work is because they're working for themselves, not as stewards over what God has given them, in other words, themselves. And secondly, they don't respect that work itself is a biblical idea. In the garden, God tells Adam to work the forest, to work the things. And if we come forward to the New Testament, Paul says very specifically, if a man will not work, neither shall he eat. But the biblical version of work is that it's a calling. And the reason it can say that is go right back to this notion of stewardship. If we are stewards over God's resources for His purposes, then our work is to support Him, not us. And when we put work in that light, it's not a negative. It's not a daily grind. It's an opportunity to serve. And that's the reason we should be doing that. It's for the idea of stewardship and work tied together. Third, as a principle, let's talk about private property, charity, and debt. The Bible supports throughout it private property. So for those who say the Bible has socialist tendencies, that's not true at all. It's a blatant falsehood. Going back to the basic commandment that says, thou shalt not steal, that implies private ownership, because how can you steal if someone else doesn't own it? And that's carried up through different parts of the Testament. Where was it? I was going to say, in 1 Kings, it talks about seizing someone else's property as being unjust. So the Bible is supporting private property. But again, go back to stewardship. The private property that we have been entrusted with belongs to God. And therefore, while we are stewards over that private property, we are also commanded to have charity in our hearts. It talks about having, in the land question, and this goes back to Paul, to be a cheerful giver and leave some of your land for the poor. We are commanded not just to be stewards and hard workers and have private property rights, but to be generous and good charitable givers. If you look at the United States, and I am blown away by some statistics that we see from time to time, go back to the 70s and before that. So almost the entirety of our nation. We were the most generous nation on earth. We gave away more in charitable monies than any other nation ever had. We were a Judeo-Christian based charitable country. Did we have greedy people? Sure. But most people weren't. They might be wealthy, but they weren't greedy because they shared that Judeo-Christian ethics of stewardship. And not even directly. For most businesses, it was just embedded. We serve our constituents, and that includes the community. Some of that changed, by the way, in 1982 when the SEC changed a securities law that made it possible for companies to buy back their own stock. That's part of why we've seen this movement toward quarterly, stock price behavior, and I think that's real unhealthy. I'd like to see if we can move away from that. But the core of why we've seen this income disparity happen and the core of why we've seen greed becoming more and more of a thing is because we've moved away from our core of a Judeo-Christian ethic. We've taken the guardrails off. And when you take the guardrails off, so you're no longer a steward, you're no longer working for him, you no longer have private property for his purposes with charity, well, now you're looking at building things for yourself, and that becomes greedy by its nature. I mean, we can go back and look at any part of Scripture as it relates to debt. It talks about individually not being a borrower because you become a slave to the debt holder. Well, that's true, and our country is built on debt. Now, it does, for those of you who say, banks are bad, it's not. It talks about lending money to businesses. And there's a big difference between business-to-business lending and business-to-individual lending. So separate that right out. From a biblical view of economics, business lending is fine. On an individual level, there is the year of Jubilee and other things that would indicate, maybe you're not so smart loaning people money because they don't have to pay you back. That's a deeper study for another day. But the whole idea is that we are to be owners and stewards of free markets and free money, but with compassion. Doesn't mean you're stupid with it. The Bible has story after story again of being smart with money. But we want to be stewards, we want to work hard, we want to have our private property, and we want to have charity. Now, as you come down that, you start to deal with this issue of wealth. And I would argue that wealth without contentment is chaos. And that's kind of what we have. Wealth in and of itself isn't bad. The fact that there is a billionaire or a 10 billionaire isn't in and of itself bad. It doesn't mean because they have it, you don't. We don't live in a zero-sum economy. We don't. And for that wealthy person, there's only 4 things they can do with their money, by the way. I hear these things all the time about let's eliminate the billionaires. Okay, if you have $1 billion, there's 4 things you can do. Okay, just 4. You can spend it. Well, that's good for the economy. So that's a productive use of your money. You can invest it. That's good for the economy. It puts more money up for companies to grow and capital be accumulated. You can save it, which puts more money in the system for housing mortgages, business loans, car loans, or you can give it away. Charity, in which case you are generous and the recipient is grateful. Those are 4 things you can do. But when we say let's take it from them and give it to government, what happens then? Well, let's take the 10 billionaire. You're going to strip $1 billion. You leave it with him. He'll do one of those 4 things. Take it over to government. They're going to do this with it. First, 20%, give or take, is going to be stripped off for bureaucracy to administer it. The rest of it is going to be granted out through not-for-profits or government programs that on a one-time basis get spent. There's no growth to the economy. It's just spent. Now, near term, it's stimulative because you throw that much money into spending, consumer spending bumps up, and you get a boost up from that. But there's no long-term investment. There's no long-term savings, and there's no charity. Government programs are not charity. They're anything but. In charity, you have someone who's, a charitable person with a grateful recipient. In government, They've taken the money from somewhere else, so they're not charitable. And the person receiving it's not grateful. They're entitled. So don't tell me that they do charity. They don't. So government either squanders the money or we leave it in the hands of the private person who does one of those four things. I want to leave it in their hands. There's no question I go to that. But let's go down to, wealth as a bondage. And it can be. You talk about in the book or in the New Testament, for a man to get to heaven, it's easier than a camel go through the eye of a needle. Well, the needle they're talking about is a gate. And to go through the gate, they had to strip off the stuff from the camel. And the reason it says that isn't that wealth is bad. It's the love of money that's bad. It's not being a steward over it for God's purposes, but being a steward over it for your own purposes. When you become the center of your life, then money becomes a bondage to you. Money doesn't bring happiness. Neither does the lack of money, but money certainly doesn't. In fact, it can often just bring chaos. Now, I've lived in a world where I've had a lot of money and I've lost a lot of money, and I've been on both sides of the equation. It doesn't affect happiness either way. If your purposes are God's and you're looking outside of yourself to the Lord, well, you're not going to find that kind of chaos and misery when you don't have it. You might find it if you're not looking to Him when you have it. So money itself is neither good nor bad. It just is. It's what's your purpose with the money? Am I a steward over God's business, or am I running it for me to make more and more and more for me? That's the greed. It still benefits the economy. A rising tide lifts all boats, so it makes the economy grow. There is no hoarding, by the way. I talk to people about this all the time because the Bible clearly is against hoarding. But the wealthy person, there isn't, on those four options, hoarding it doesn't work. They don't put cash in their mattress. They're not that stupid. So they don't hoard the money. They put it out into the world because that's what makes it grow. But this idea of greed again, the lack of a covenant with God and the lack of looking at it as a brotherly community in which you are there to help and to support your brothers and your sisters. We are a community of believers, and businesses exist to support the community. Yes, to you too, and you want to do well for you and your family. But charitable people, we are commanded to be, also help their community at large. And that's why it worked here. For the first 200 years, it worked. In the last 30 years, 40 years, we've moved away from a Judeo-Christian ethic, and we've moved then into a world of meism, of true selfishness and true greed. And that just leads to chaos. It is a system that will not create happiness. And when you happiness and prosperity tied together on a journey, the happiness component goes away. So as we look at economics, we have to understand that number one, we're going to try to be stewards over God's resources. Number two, we work to improve His resources, whether it's ourselves, our families, or somebody else. Number three, we are instructed to have private property, but with generosity, and to be charitable in our resources. And fourth, we're not to be greedy. We're to serve God with our money, and we're to have purpose behind our money. So if you build an economic mindset based on those values, you transcend the secular capitalism versus socialism issue. And I think you'll end up with an economic model that works for the long run, because it does talk about individual reliance. We are accountable to our God individually, but we're generous so we help our community. If you look on the left today, they want to penalize people with money and give it away. Well, that just creates chaos, which we're seeing more and more of, right? On the right, they want to keep the money, but for the wrong reason. Now, it's their own money, and I don't judge them for it. I just tell them, if you're not doing it for God's purposes, you will find a hollow master in that money. And I do believe there's some legislative stuff we could do. I'd like to see the SEC rescind that argument that companies are incentivized to buy back their own stock. I think that's a really unhealthy situation because not only does it relate to manipulation in the stock price, but it forces a company to be more concerned about its quarterly stock price than anything else. And that's been part of the problem we've had in our compensation issues and the income disparity in this country. But this economics issue, I think we'll talk more about it in the future, but it's very real that you develop an economic framework that you believe in. And it helps because you're going to have retirement monies to look at. You're going to have grandchildren's money to help with. You're going to have all these individual needs, how you look at your house, your car, yourself. You're a steward over that for his purposes. And that's not radical Christianity, by the way. That's just Judeo-Christian basics. I hope most of us can agree on that, because that's where contentment comes from. And if you find yourself in a discontented space, maybe you need to change your economic framework to go back to a biblical view of economics. Now, again, when you join me tomorrow, we're going to talk about insurance. I want to talk about risk management. And yes, we're going to use biblical principles for it. But I want to talk about risk management and the cost of it and the value of it and what it's there for. Because in the area of insurance, I think there's a misconception as to what it's for. So we'll talk about that. And I welcome you, as always. Write me at steve@stevebeaman.com with questions. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, Tuesday, the 30th day of September, as we join once again on the Steve Beaman journey. Thanks for joining me.